What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
America Trends podcast is part of the MHNR Network, mhnrnetwork.com. Welcome back to America Trends podcast. I'm Larry Rifkin. Recently, I was asked if I would be a partner in a conversation about American politics today with a Congresswoman from Connecticut, Elizabeth Esty. I was honored to do so, and you are going to hear the entirety of that conversation today, courtesy of StoryCorps. Now, the recording was recorded and facilitated by Camila Kerwin of StoryCorps. We did it at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. I hope you find it illuminating. I'm Larry Rifkin. I'm 66 years of age. Today is Friday, October 12th. We are in Hartford, Connecticut. And my relationship to my partner in this recording is that we've been professional colleagues, and I'd like to think friends.
I'm Elizabeth Esty. I am age 59. Today is also Friday, October 12th, which is a good thing. We're in Hartford, Connecticut, and my relationship with my partner here at Larry Rifkin is we have been professional colleagues for probably 8 or 9 years now, 10 years, something like that, and friends, and I would like to think fellow soldiers in the fight for a better country and better democracy.
I like that. But Elizabeth, I've got to ask you, because I'm your guest, why did you invite me?
Well, number one, you've got a great radio voice. Now, I thought we'd have an interesting conversation, genuinely. I mean, the country is deeply divided. We are both huge patriots and lovers of Waterbury, Connecticut, of this state and this country, and believers in democracy. And I know we're both really pained with where things are now. So I thought we could have an interesting conversation, and wide-ranging, because you always prepare a lot, as you said. And that would be interesting. Also, I'd kind of like to know more of your backstory about how you wound up doing what you do.
Well, I'd love to tell you that. It's not that interesting, but it is all centric to Waterbury, which is the largest city in your district. And I love to think of myself as a Waterbury guy, even though I think a lot of people, when they have that term attached to them, Waterbury, it's sometimes seen as a negative. But I always thought Waterbury was a great place to grow up. I thought it was a wonderful location for me. It reminded me of a little Brooklyn with all ethnicities represented, and our parents would throw us out at the break of dawn, and we'd come back at dusk, and we would have had great experiences with all kinds of young people. But when I ultimately came up to Hartford, where we are today, and you brought me to a location that is so close to everything that I am today or ever was professionally, and that was the location here at Trinity College, where I was the head of programming at Connecticut Public Television for many years. So you brought me back to a really interesting place in my life, and I want to thank you for that.
Well, it's interesting what you were saying about Waterbury, because you're right. I mean, Waterbury gets, in a lot of ways, a bad rap, but I agree with you. I describe it to people as tribal. But I mean that in a good way, in an affectionate way, because, you were raised as what they call now a free-range kid. So was I. I mean, I'm third of 4 kids, born in 4.5 years. My mother would shove us out the door after school, get your homework done, and then go and don't come back until it's dinner time, unless we had chores to do. Once the homework was done, it was then go out, mess around, do not bother me. And I kind of regret, I think that's one of the things we're really losing in our country right now, that autonomy and the mixing that kids have, and kids learning to make their way in the world and intermediate disputes and not look around for adults to do so. And you meet people by chance and you don't self-segregate. So I'm really concerned about where we are with the echo chamber
I agree with you.
Echo chamber, only talking to people who agree with you, only reading the news that comports with your views. And that's such a disservice to our country and democracy and our humanity. It deprives us of the commonality, and I'm deeply concerned about that right now.
Well, it's pretty remarkable because when I first met you, I didn't really know much about your background. And I'll admit that during your first campaign, I was very impressed with both you and your opponent. And although I don't vote in your district because I was gerrymandered out in my little suburban part of
you're in the south
Waterbury.
part of Waterbury.
Yeah, so I'm in Prospect, and so I'm in the 3rd district. But I will say that I was impressed by both of you. But when I did hear you speak, and I heard you talk about bipartisanship and about what you intended to be if you were elected, I said, well, let's see. Let's see if she really means that, because I think I have been a more moderate to liberal type over the years. And sometimes that moderate piece where I find myself agreeing with conservatives on various things would get me into trouble with some of my more liberal friends. And I said, it'll be curious to see how she, as a congresswoman, actually votes and legislates. And I think you have held up your end of that bargain tremendously well. And what I find really interesting about you during your career is that a lot of congressmen today, I think, have become super pundits. They're out there all the time pontificating about this, that, and the other, but they're not getting a lot done. And I've seen you in the midst of all this rancor, in the midst of all this turmoil in Washington, actually kind of keep your head down and get things done. And I'm really impressed by that. But more importantly, some of my conservative friends and colleagues in broadcasting, when I indicated you and I were going to be talking, they really respect you. And that's not easy today. It really isn't.
Well, that means a lot to me. I mean, my dad was a Republican till my mother got a hold of him. His parents were rock rib Republicans. I mean, country club, the plastic on the furniture, the whole thing. I know there are good people in this country, and nobody's got a lock on the right ideas. I ended up doing what I'm doing. I didn't expect to do it, but I was raised really. And some of the questions here I think are good on this front, because I don't think you know this backstory, how I ended up doing politics, which is not what I expected to do.
Well, I do know that your daughter challenged you.
She did.
Because I remember you telling that story recently at an event that I was at, and that impressed me that you actually listened to your daughter, because the most important decision I probably ever made in my professional life was because I listened to my daughter.
Yeah. Well, I think I come from a long line of feisty women. My grandmother's grandmother came over from Holland in 1848 to Holland, Michigan, which is a really conservative Dutch reform.
She didn't want to go too far, Holland.
No, well, the people who didn't go to Holland, Michigan went to South Africa and became the Boers. So let's be very clear about where this line is. And she was notorious for two things. One is that they had no money, so she pulled the plow. My great-great-grandmother. And the other is she got in such a theological dispute with her minister that she went to church and sat there and didn't speak to him for 20 years. So that says something about how feisty the women in my mother's side of the family are. And for my grandmother, she really became inspired to fight against the evil of segregation in education. So she lived in Oak Park, Illinois, was head of the Board of Education, and ended up becoming a lobbyist for the Presbyterian Church, was the first lobbyist in the 1940s and 50s. She left my mother at home and took the train to D.C. and lobbied for civil rights. And it was out of a deeply religiously based view, like we're all children of God, and this is just wrong. It's wrong that these poor black kids aren't getting the same education, and it may not be official segregation in the North, but it darn well is segregation. I only recently learned from my mother, who's got Alzheimer's, so the stories kind of come and go. I only learned about 10 years ago from her that when she moved from Oak Park, Illinois with my father and 4 little kids under the age of 5 to Northern California, she was looking for where to live, and she'd grown up in Oak Park, which is a very historic place. She lived next door or around the corner from Frank Lloyd Wright's studio. Hemingway is one of those historical cities. And she moved to Northern California, and she was looking at places to live, and this would have been 1961. And she'd heard about this new architect called Eichler, who was affordable homes for everyone. And she wanted to look at them. And the real estate agent said, "Oh, I don't know if you want to live there. You don't know whom you might be living next door to." And that was the first time I realized there were restrictive covenants still going in the early 60s in California. And I didn't think about that. And she said, "No, that's exactly where I want to live. That's exactly where I want to live." So I grew up in this, in this little community of San Mateo, California, in the Highlands, where one of my best friend's fathers had been a Holocaust survivor, and that was my first understanding of that, was seeing the numbers on his arm and asking him about that, and hearing the story about how he and one of his brothers survived running off in the woods and nobody else did from his family. But I walked to school at age 5 down the street. I was there this past summer. I drove my mother past the old house and to the school and kind of trying to restore her memories. But my mother was inspired around gay rights issues. And again, it wasn't what she wanted. She's deeply religious, also Presbyterian, and I'd had a fight with her in 1978. She was fighting because the Presbyterian Church was arguing about ordination of gays, and she said, "I've been praying about this. I was in college. I've been praying about it, and I think it's a sin." And my grandmother, her mother, and I had this big argument with my mother in June. Come December, my brother picks me up. My brother's a year older, picks me up from the airport. I'd been working in D.C., taking a year off from school. And he said, "I have something to tell you. And the only thing that popped in my head is you're gay." But I did not want to say that because I didn't know if it was true. And it was 1978, right? That was rural Minnesota. We were both at Hartford for college, but that was a pretty big thing to guess. And I said, "Don't make me guess." And he said, "I'm in love." I'm like, "That's pretty clear. You're the happiest I've ever seen you." And then he told me all about his first boyfriend. And my mother went from, "This is a sin," to testifying in front of Congress against the Defense of Marriage Act. Wow. That was the transition she made from having believed this was a sin to following her heart and her commitment to the younger of her 2 sons, to say, like, I've got to learn more. So she started ordering books that came in brown paper wrappings from City Lights in San Francisco, and she ended up becoming president of PFLAG, which is the Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays.
Did you ever have such a change, or even during your term in Congress, has there been an issue where you had one position and it was heartfelt at the time, but then you, through evolution, through more information, through whatever change of heart, really looked at it again in a totally different light?
Some things I would say a lot of things I've come to see in much more nuanced light than I used to. I mean, I've always felt very strongly on the gun issue, and who would have known that with the shootings in Newtown that happened just after I was elected. I was elected on November 6th, 2012, and those shootings happened on December 14th of 2012, and I was sitting at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government when we got word, and I drove straight to Newtown. And that, for me, I mean, if there's a single issue that I could see being like a defining thread of my life, it would be that politically, which I felt strongly about, but actually opposition to the death penalty, which frankly was what launched me into Congress, weirdly. I mean, my vote against the death penalty with the Pettit murders in
and
Cheshire.
That was very difficult, being a Cheshire resident.
I lived a mile from the Pettits when that happened. And so, I've had to think a lot about what the role of a representative is. I will tell you the one that I've been thinking about more recently, and that actually has to do with what the Republicans might call entitlement programs, welfare. I've been thinking about the fact that we've had 50 years of the war on poverty, and I think about how heated the rhetoric is in Congress. And the people I've gotten to know, like Paul Ryan, Speaker Paul Ryan, a bunch of Republicans who I've gotten to know well, who I think are good and decent human beings. And I know they intend best for the country. And it's forced me to really think about whether we're defending people or programs, that it's not good enough to have a good intent. And the fact is we still have a heck of a lot of poverty. And so maybe it's time to look at how we're approaching the problem and not I feel too much on the Democratic side. There's too much defensive. This is a program we intended for this purpose, so it's good enough. You have to keep defending it no matter what. And my view was, like, couldn't it be better? Shouldn't we be looking at whether it's actually achieving the goals? And frankly, I've heard a lot about that in the African-American churches, in the community meetings that I go to, of real frustration and anger sometimes at the Democratic Party of saying, like, you don't get a pass on this. Look how I'm living. Look at what is happening in my community. Don't go get all sanctimonious on me like you know.
Well, did Donald Trump make a point during the 2016 election when he said, well, maybe Democrats are just taking the African-American community for granted, and that it's almost preordained that that vote is coming the Democrats' way without earning it with some new thinking and some new ideas? I know for me, and the times that I've begun to get more moderate, it's looking, as you said, for nuance. Looking, there's got to be another way to look at this. And I worried that a lot of the economic breadbasket issues were not being dealt with, and that the Democratic Party was beginning to waft away into more boutique items that lost a lot of Americans, and I could sense that. And I wanted the party to get back to its roots. I wanted to see a Truman-esque or a JFK. I mean, I grew up with JFK as my role model. So my life has been in public service in a totally different way, in the media, working for nonprofit organizations, even doing a podcast today that really looks at trends on our society and politics. And I've always taken a very open view to whatever conversation I'm having. And that's because I grew up with a sense that public service and public opportunity really opened up doors for so many people. I'm just really wondering today, Elizabeth, with Donald Trump as the president, as opposed to JFK, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, or aspiring to find a place on the moon. I mean, what are we asking our young people to consider as hope, promise, possibility? What is it?
Well, I'm appalled at where we are. But I think I understand a lot of why we are where we are. I mean, it's happening around the world. I mean, that's one thing. The pace of change is too fast. But there was overpromising and lack of empathy. You know, you look at the internationalization of the world, there have been big winners and big losers, and the promise was kind of to get things through politically. Everybody wins with trade, you know, everybody wins with globalization. In the short term, that's just not true. We haven't shared the benefits of globalization. We haven't shared the benefits of trade. Some people have done not just remarkably, obscenely well, and power to them, but, you know, there's a responsibility that comes with that. I mean, I was raised in part by a grandmother whose views on this were, number one, to waste your talents is a sin. Nobody's better than anyone else. Sort of the biblical to he or she to whom much is given, much is expected. And what so upsets me right now is no sense of that commonality, that if you're in public life in any way, you have an obligation, an opportunity and obligation to provide that opportunity for others. Because it is, so much of it is luck in life. And I've been the beneficiary of undeserved good fortune. And people.
But why do you say that?
Because people have, I mean, I have been. I had loving parents. I never had to worry about whether there was food on the table. I mean, my mother did. My grandfather lost his job the day my mother was born. He went out the door. Think about this, Larry. He got up, got dressed, and went out the door for 2 weeks. Because he could not tell my grandmother in 1933, where they had a 6-year-old and a newborn. He could not tell her that he didn't have a job and had no idea what they were going to do. He could not even tell her. And so when people say, like, why should we have, you know, welfare or food stamps, I think about my grandfather and my grandmother and what they went through and how humiliated he was, and how people want to work, people need to work, people want to provide for their families. And when we don't do that, which is part of the problem now, like, people don't feel that their dignity and worth is being recognized. And I do think of much of the rise of not just Trump, but what we see in Austria with a 31-year-old sort of autocrat. The rise of autocrats is about fear, but also feeling of being disrespected,
But
being
why
devalued, and so that we've got to find a way to fix that.
Well, you talked about the pace of automation and artificial intelligence and all of these things that we can't really
Control.
So what is it? Do we need a new social contract? Do we need a new way of looking at what value we have in our lives, how we have purpose and meaning that goes even beyond work? Because this is a really wonderful moment when people can actually actualize what they want. I mean, without having to work 15 hours a day under the hot sun. It's a wonderful time in many ways.
It could be, and I think that's sort of the promise or the hope of that. I think people feel not needed. I think work provides structure.
Where's that
and
message
value.
coming from?
Frankly, there has been elitism, for example. I think the value of all work is not being respected. I think the unintended consequence of a message, especially out of the Democratic side, I would say, of that college is for everyone and those are the jobs that sort of count, has been deeply disrespectful and frankly untrue. It's ended up saddling a lot of people with debt. I think it's an unintended consequence of, in reaction to Barack Obama. I think he's seen as an elitist, and I think he very importantly and effectively advocated against the tyranny of low expectations. But I think in so doing, in some ways, that has provoked a feeling of like, I think of it, you talking to me? Are you talking to me? Oh, like what happened to my job at the factory? I think about those guys in Waterbury whose fathers were able to buy a new truck every 5 years and the moms didn't have to work and they had a good job in the factory, and now they look at their wives, have a double shift at the hospital, and the only job they can get is a service job that pays a quarter of what the factory job used to pay, and they've got a kid home in the basement with 2 years of debt from college, and they are mad as hell, and they're not going to take a damn service job, and they think they were sold a bill of goods, and I think that's how we got where we are.
Well, actually, it's not the most meaningful political decision. It was the most meaningful professional decision. But I couched it because you've said that if it wasn't for your daughter, you never would have run because she challenged you, said, you've got a lot of opinions, Mom, so let's put it to the test. And you saw the wisdom in that, perhaps never thinking before that you put yourself before the public for their commendation or their rejection or whatever. No, but in my case, I was blessed to find, and I've always felt that in my life, there's a great song called Just Another Place I Don't Belong. And I found myself in so many places I don't belong, but somehow I made my way. And they were great experiences, one and all. So I ended up as assistant to the Commissioner of Education in Connecticut without knowing anything about education policy and writing speeches for a Harvard-trained educator who was the superintendent of schools in Philadelphia and then the commissioner in Connecticut. I mean, things like that. Or going into television when really I didn't have a background in particular in production, but overseeing some pretty remarkable production over the years at Connecticut Public Television. But it was the decision to listen to my daughter when she said that there was a children's property that she thought she wanted to see over and over again in home video. We brought it home on Super Bowl Sunday in 1992 and began watching Barney and the Backyard Gang. And ultimately, through her eyes, I was able to see the possibilities in this because PBS was looking for a new children's series to go along with Sesame Street and Fred Rogers, and there it was. So the next day, I called the woman in Texas who had developed it, and away we went to a 17-year partnership and just changing the face of children's programming. I think a lot of people could say that Nickelodeon and Nick Jr. came about because of Barney. So I listened to my daughter. I saw through her eyes, just as you saw through your daughter's eyes, that you really had the potential to do even more in public service.
Well, and I think it's also, some of that is actually listening. And that's what I despair of right now. I think people aren't listening to each other. And that actually takes, and I've learned this a lot with what I'm doing, we've sort of lost persuasion. I think about it's just haranguing. I mean, Congress is nobody's giving speeches to persuade anyone. It's pandering to the base. It's beating the drum for the base, trying to get on TV, as you said, which is why I don't do much of it.
Yeah,
because I'm trying to get stuff done in the back of the room and working on legislation.
Well, what do you think of those who are spending so much time in front of the camera without criticizing any one colleague? Because nothing seemingly other than getting Supreme Court justices through is getting done.
Well, I think it's what's getting rewarded. People respond to the incentives in the system, and the incentives right now are the incentives of make a name for yourself. You can raise more money, you get on TV, you get attention, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the media and that sort of where we are, media and politics, in what I think is an extremely destructive dance going on right now, where the public doesn't believe in facts. Media, and I have to say, I watch less than I used to. I try to read more. I watch the Sunday shows. I do not watch during the week. I found CNN is feeling very opinionated to me. The Times is feeling opinionated. I'm saying that as a Democrat, but I understand why my colleagues who are Republicans read that and say, nobody gets a fair shot anymore. And will disagree with my kids on that. It's like, oh, Mom, why are you saying that? I'm just like, because I now have enough empathy for people in my district, my colleagues who hear this and they shut down when they hear that talk. So I don't know what we do about that. I'm worried about the algorithms that are designed to increase division. I worry about media so beside itself. Frankly, I think media created Donald Trump. They crowded out the space. He exploited the demand and desire for eyeballs in ways that people are trying to make up for it now. And it's like, it's...
Well, Elizabeth,
I'd be curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you and I got to know each other because at first I knew your husband, and he is a public official, was somebody I interviewed all the time and respected a great deal, and we had some great conversations. He was the head of the environment department here in the state of Connecticut. And that's probably how you got to know who I was, through him. And I think he took me seriously, though I think a lot of people did not take radio interviewers terribly seriously. They looked at us as grandstanders, cartoonish, often just promoting a side or a cause and not really being serious in their journalism. But I tried to be as serious as I could. And when I approached you, I'm just wondering what you thought. I mean, in terms of where you'd like journalism to be, because coming out of that public television, CBS kind of background, the Edward R. Murrow standard, I mean, I applied that, and I was really, again, talk about a place I didn't belong. I mean, talk radio is a screaming match. I'm not that.
No,
I was
you're
never
not that, but you didn't do that. I mean, you're a serious person with diverse interests, and I always found you fair and prepared and challenging. And provocative is too strong a word, but challenging, which you should be. I mean, that's the job of a journalist, is to challenge. Don't let people get away with laziness. Don't let anybody get away with glibness or lack of depth. And that I always appreciated that
well, there
about
was one
you.
public
but
official.
They're also long enough interviews. I mean,
Right.
frankly, it's not, you don't do sound bites and you don't do gotcha. Which is, I always loved going on with you, and I think my staff was always worried. It's like, that's less you than who might call in, and you know who I'm talking about.
But I've got to tell you, there was one public official who said to me, you made me better at my job because you made me think about what I was doing. And that's what I think the role of the media should be. And I know a lot of people think it's political pornography after hours on cable today, and in certain cases, it's become that, unfortunately. And that's why I want to bring this up, because I think it's really unfortunate that you, as somebody who's a part of the Problem Solvers Caucus, getting things done, working on legislation at a time when people feel there's nothing getting done, I've got to ask you this very personally. How difficult is it for you today to know that you're stepping off the stage at a time when you're at the height of your powers. And I have seen you improve as a political figure over the years, and I'm not easily impressed. And I've talked to other people about this, seeing you at the beginning and seeing where you are today, and knowing that at least for the moment, that's going to be cut short. I mean, tell me, what does that feel like?
Well, it's obviously very mixed, and I'm not somebody who believes in regret. I think you learn from every decision you make and what happens. I would make a bunch of decisions differently given how things have turned out. But I'll tell you, there's part of me that thinks what I bring to the table is really important now, but I also think it's not what's going to be going on. I think it's going to be war of all against all for the next couple of years. Sadly, I think what's likely to happen is that Democrats will pick up the House in the election in less than a month. Republicans will continue, maintain control of the Senate. I think Democrats will probably only have a margin of about 10 seats. And I think it will be war of all against all. And it's going to be worse before it gets better. And sort of what I bring to the table is going to be nothing of what's going on. Nothing of what's going on. So I feel like my strengths as a legislator and as somebody who respectfully is working with colleagues, it's already been difficult. It's not supported very much. It's supported by the district, I will say. It's supported by the people I represent, largely, not the ideology.
Well, you would have gotten reelected by a large margin.
But I also didn't want to fight that, and it has been, some of that is fighting my own party. And that's been true my whole time in political life. I have fought ideologues within my own party, within the Democratic Party, as much or more than ideologues on the right. And so it's not an easy or good time to do that. And right now there is mob mentality, and that's fed by social media. And frankly, I think what happened to me last spring, a lot of that was, moment in time, exploitation of things by people who wanted a story. And there was a certain kind of story they wanted to tell. I could not get facts out, which I hope I'll get a chance to at some point.
Well, it's interesting in my own way. When I decided to leave the talk show after 7 years, it wasn't that I was forced out, but I know when to go, when to fold. And I felt after I did a takeoff on Donald Trump, I had a great Trump impersonator on. And he was fantastic. He really was. But people took it seriously. They thought that the ridiculous conversation we were having was actually real and that I knew him because he said, "Larry, you know me well," so on and so forth.
Oh my gosh.
And I just said to myself, that's it. I've been working too hard at this. And why? I mean, I thought I had a really educated and thoughtful audience, and to some extent, many of them were cultivated, I think, in that way, expecting more from a talk show. But after I saw that and that reaction, I knew that it was going to be really, really difficult to go on. And even regardless, I wasn't enamored with either candidate, and I just felt it was time to move on. But in many ways, you feel you've got to find new ground.
Absolutely.
And I've been doing it with my podcast, even though I've only had about 100,000 visitors, and that's good, but it's not a lot. But I'm loving what I'm doing because it's really free expression, used responsibly, without any filters. There's nobody telling me, editing me. Mm-hmm. What's your next move? I mean, now that you're not going to be constrained by all the norms or the unusual norms in Congress these days, where do you go from here?
I don't know yet, and it's when I ended up running for office in 2005. Because my daughter Sarah, then 15, challenged me to make good on my belief that I could do a better job than the men sitting on the town council in Cheshire with the school budget. I thought about becoming a minister. I thought about going to divinity school. That was an alternative career path. And so I'm really entering into what I would describe as a period of discernment, trying to figure out, where am I needed? And I think about the most extraordinary person I've served with in Congress, and that's John Lewis. And I think about how John Lewis, at age 22, made more of a difference in this country than many presidents have made, and certainly than the vast majority of members of Congress. And he made that difference before he was elected to Congress. And so one of the reasons I'm so committed to democracy is You don't have to ask permission to run, but you also don't have to be elected to make a difference. I look at, for example, the difference my grandmother made, the difference my mother made, the difference my father made, who actually quit the Boy Scouts, where he was in business, and he was on track in both the YMCA and the Boy Scouts of America to be on national boards. And because of the stance on gay rights within the Boy Scouts, he quit the Boy Scouts, put his energy into the Y, and became president of the Y board, and pushed the Y to have the most gay-friendly policies. They're the largest child care provider in America, and that became, although it wasn't his job, it became his passion in life. So I know other doors open, and in some ways I'll be freed up to do that. And frankly, I really hate this sort of pundit, talk show, get on TV, fight, all me stuff. And I think real leadership is about bringing out the best in other people. It's not what we're seeing in politics right now. But I hope to, and maybe doing that with other former members. I've been talking with a number of former members of Congress, and there's some initiatives about civic engagement and other things, which I really feel strongly about education. Finding a way to serve, like you are now. And I think you're despairing about the state of media and politics. I am about both as well. And there are so many things we could do.
Oh, absolutely.
It's actually just picking which ones. And I will tell you, I don't miss making phone calls to raise money. That's for darn sure. That's one of the best things about not running.
Oh, and that's such a terrible thing, spending 50% of your time doing that. Well, I'm glad that you're going to be freed up to do so many things, and I'm really going to be looking forward to perhaps, once again, reporting on them. Who knows?
Well, I want to thank you for agreeing to sit down with me today, and you're a great American, a great friend, and I respect you a lot. And I hopefully will be in a year in a better place for
Absolutely.
For the country.
I look forward to it. Who knows?
Well, I want to thank you.